The dog should have been watching the man who came to save her. Instead, with what little strength she had left, she kept staring into the trees. Night had settled over the Oregon mountains like a dark blanket, and the old service road was nearly invisible beneath the tall pines. Wind moved softly through the branches, carrying the dry scent of needles, dust, and distant cedar. Somewhere beyond the ridge, an owl called once, then fell silent. Mason Reed stood beside an abandoned ranger station with a flashlight in one hand and a pair of bolt cutters in the other. At 38, the former Navy SEAL had learned to trust silence. Silence could tell you when a room was empty, when a storm was coming, when something unseen was wrong. Tonight, the silence had been broken by metal. Scratch. Pause. Scratch. That faint sound had pulled him off the road and through nearly 50 yards of brush to a storage shed leaning beneath the weight of years. Inside, behind warped boards and rusted tools, he found the cage. The German Shepherd lay curled against its far wall, black and tan fur dull beneath a coat of dust. Her ribs showed beneath her sides. An empty water bowl rested near the door. One front paw was tucked carefully beneath her chest, and every breath seemed to require a decision. Yet her amber eyes were awake. Mason slowly lowered himself to one knee. "Easy, girl." Her ears moved toward his voice, but her eyes did not. They remained fixed past him, through a broken section of wall, toward the forest. Mason set his flashlight on the ground so the beam would not strike her face. Then he placed his canteen beside the cage and poured water into the empty bowl. The sound changed her breathing. She smelled it. He could see that, but she did not drink. "Come on," Mason whispered. "Nobody's asking you to be brave tonight." Still nothing. Then the wind shifted. The dog lifted her head. It was barely an inch, but Mason saw it. Her nose turned east. Her body tightened. A soft sound rose from her chest. Not anger, not fear. Urgency. Mason followed her gaze into the darkness. Nothing moved between the pines. He looked back and noticed something beneath the cage, half hidden in the dry mud. Tracks, small ones. Several of them. Mason's expression changed. He reached for the bolt cutters. The German Shepherd watched his hands now. One cut. The old chain dropped against the floor with a dull clink. Mason opened the cage door and stepped back. "You're free." She tried to rise. Her legs trembled, and Mason moved forward just in time to steady her. For one brief second, the dog finally looked into his eyes. Then she turned toward the forest again, gathered a breath from somewhere deep inside her exhausted body, and barked once into the night. The sound traveled through the trees and disappeared. Mason waited. Far beyond the ranger station, where the forest should have been completely dark, a faint orange glow flickered between the trunks. Then the German Shepherd collapsed gently against his arms. Mason caught her before her weight reached the dirt, one arm beneath her chest and the other supporting her trembling body. She was lighter than a German Shepherd her size had any right to be. Beneath the dusty coat, he could feel the fragile rise and fall of each breath. For a moment, he forgot the orange glow beyond the trees. The dog in his arms was the only thing that mattered. "Stay with me, girl." Her ears shifted at his voice. That was enough. Mason carried her through the brush toward his pickup, moving carefully over roots and loose stones. The night air had cooled, but the ground still held the dry heat of late summer. Pine needles cracked beneath his boots. Behind him, the abandoned ranger station disappeared into darkness, leaving only that faint smell of rust and old timber. Mason had not planned to be on this road after sunset. He had not planned to be in Oregon more than 3 days. The cabin waiting 7 miles north had belonged to his father, and Mason had returned for one reason: empty it, sign the papers, and leave. At 38, he had become good at leaving. After years as a Navy SEAL, departure felt simpler than belonging. Pack what mattered. Carry what you could. Do not look too long at what remained. The cabin was supposed to be another closed door. Then he heard the scratching. Now a German Shepherd was breathing against his chest as though his arrival had been scheduled by something neither of them understood. At the pickup, Mason lowered the tailgate and spread an old canvas blanket across it. He set her down gently, then brought the canteen to her muzzle. Just a little. This time she drank. 3 careful laps. She stopped, lifted her head, and looked toward the forest again. Mason followed her gaze. The orange light he had seen moments earlier was gone. No flames. No smoke visible against the night sky. Maybe it had been the last edge of sunset caught between the trees. Maybe a distant cabin light. Still, something about the dog's attention bothered him. He returned to the ranger station with the flashlight and studied the ground beneath the cage. The small tracks were clearer now. Tiny paw prints crossed the dried mud near the rear wall, some overlapping, some fading beneath fallen needles. Mason crouched and touched one with 2 fingers, too small to belong to the shepherd. His eyes moved toward the cage. The door had been secured from the outside. Nearby, the empty bowl was coated with dust. This had not happened hours ago. He stood slowly. Back at the truck, the German shepherd had pushed herself upright. She swayed on weak legs, but refused to lie down. Her nose pointed east, toward the same black wall of pines. Mason opened the passenger door. I know. He lifted her onto the blanket across the seat. But first, I have to keep you alive. She watched him as he started the engine. For the first time, her amber eyes stayed on his face. Mason pulled onto the service road and turned toward the nearest town. In the side mirror, the forest vanished behind them. The dog turned to watch it disappear, and a quiet whine escaped her throat. Mason tightened his hands around the steering wheel. He had heard that sound before, not from a dog, but from people forced to leave someone behind. And suddenly, 7 miles from a cabin he intended to sell, Mason Reed knew this night was not going to end at a veterinary clinic. The veterinary clinic sat 12 miles south of the forest, a small brick building beside a closed feed store where one porch light burned against the dark. Mason pulled into the empty lot a little after 10 o'clock and killed the engine. For several seconds, the German shepherd did not move. She sat weakly on the blanket, staring through the rear window toward the road they had traveled. Mason reached across the seat. We are not forgetting them. He did not know why he said it. Maybe because of the tracks beneath the cage. Maybe because some promises were made before you understood what they would cost. The dog finally looked at him. Mason lifted her carefully and carried her to the entrance, where an overnight bell brought Dr. Claire Bennett from a room behind the lobby. She was in her early 40s, dressed in blue scrubs beneath a faded gray sweatshirt, her brown hair pulled back loosely as though sleep had been interrupted. The tiredness vanished from her face when she saw the animal in Mason's arms. Bring her in. The examination room smelled of antiseptic and clean cotton. Mason placed the shepherd on a padded table while Claire worked quietly, checking her breathing, temperature, paws, eyes, and hydration. The dog remained calm until Claire touched the old collar around her neck. Then her head rose. Her amber eyes moved toward the door. She has been without enough water for a while, Claire said softly. She is exhausted, but she is still fighting. Mason glanced at the shepherd. That part one noticed. Claire gave her fluids and set a shallow bowl nearby. This time the dog drank without hesitation. Mason watched each small swallow, as if it were a victory no one should celebrate too loudly. Does she have a name? Claire asked. Mason looked at the worn collar. No tag, no lettering, nothing except a faint reddish stain from Oregon dust. Not one I know. The shepherd lifted her head again when a truck passed outside. Her ears turned toward the fading engine sound. Then she tried to stand. Claire gently steadied her. Easy. The dog pushed forward anyway, eyes fixed on the exit. Mason felt the same unease return. I found tracks under the cage. Small paw prints. Claire stopped. She examined the shepherd again, more carefully this time, then looked at Mason. She has had puppies recently. The room seemed to become very still. Mason remembered the tiny prints disappearing toward the eastern trees. The empty bowl. The locked cage. The way she had ignored water when he first found her. The way she had used almost everything left in her body to bark toward the forest. Claire lowered her voice. If the puppies are still out there, they could be several miles away. Mason looked through the clinic window. Beyond the parking lot, the mountains were nothing but a black shape against the stars. He had spent years learning that darkness could hide distance, weather, fear, and sometimes hope. Behind him, the shepherd stepped off the blanket before Claire could stop her. Her legs shook. She crossed only a few feet before sinking beside Mason's boots. Still, her nose pointed toward the door. Mason crouched and rested his hand near her shoulder. You have been trying to tell me all night. The dog pressed her muzzle against his wrist. Mason looked at Claire. Get her strong enough to travel. Claire studied him for a moment. Where are you going? Mason's eyes returned to the shepherd. Back to the cage. Outside, somewhere beyond 12 miles of dark road and silent timber, the wind was beginning to rise. Claire wanted 6 hours. Mason gave her 2. By midnight, the German Shepherd had taken fluids, eaten a small portion of food, and managed to stand without falling. It was not recovery, Claire warned him. It was borrowed strength. Mason understood borrowed strength better than most men. Sometimes it was all you needed to reach morning. Claire wrapped the dog in a clean blanket and walked them to the pickup beneath a sky crowded with stars. Keep her warm. Keep her quiet. If she weakens, you turn around. Mason nodded. The shepherd was already staring north. I do not think quiet is what she has in mind. 40 minutes later, the pickup rolled back onto the Forest Service road. The wind had strengthened, pushing dry leaves across the headlights. Mason lowered the window several inches. Pine and cold earth entered the cab. The shepherd lifted her muzzle immediately. Her ears rose. For the first time that night, something returned to her eyes that looked stronger than exhaustion. Purpose. Mason stopped beside the abandoned ranger station and opened the passenger door. We do this your way. She climbed down slowly. Mason expected her to return to the cage. She did not. She crossed the clearing, stopped near the eastern tree line, and looked back. Mason grabbed his flashlight, water, blanket, and a small first aid bag Claire had insisted he take. Then he followed. The forest swallowed them within 20 yards. Moonlight broke through the branches in pale strips. The dog moved carefully, nose close to the ground, pausing whenever her legs began to shake. Mason never rushed her. Each time she stopped, he waited. Each time she continued, he followed. Nearly half a mile in, she froze beside a fallen cedar. Mason swept his flashlight over the ground. Tiny paw prints marked a patch of soft soil, the same size as those beneath the cage. His chest tightened. Good girl. Her tail moved once. It was the first time Mason had seen it move. They continued downhill until the trees opened around a narrow creek bed, dry from the summer heat. The shepherd suddenly quickened her pace. Mason heard nothing at first. Then came a sound so faint, he almost mistook it for wind slipping through grass. A whimper. The shepherd stopped. Another answered from somewhere ahead. Her whole body trembled, but this time not from weakness. She stepped toward a cluster of exposed roots beneath an old Douglas fir and lowered herself to the ground. Mason approached slowly. His flashlight found a shallow hollow protected by earth and roots. 3 tiny shapes were curled together inside. German Shepherd puppies. Their coats were dusty, their bodies pressed close for warmth. One lifted its head and made a soft cry. The mother answered with a sound Mason had not heard from her before, low and gentle, almost like relief. She crawled into the hollow and touched each puppy with her nose, counting them in the only way she knew. Mason knelt beside them and felt something inside him loosen. You found them. For several quiet seconds, the forest seemed merciful. Then the shepherd backed away from her puppies. Mason frowned. She turned uphill instead of settling beside them. What is it? She looked at him, then toward the darkness beyond the creek. Her nose lifted. Mason smelled it a moment later, faint beneath the pine and dust. Fuel. The dog took one unsteady step forward. Mason looked at the 3 puppies, then at their mother. She had brought him to what she loved most, and somehow, she was telling him they were not finished. Mason did not follow her immediately. He took off his jacket, folded it into the hollow beneath the Douglas fir, and carefully moved the 3 puppies onto the warm fabric. Their mother watched every movement. Only when the smallest pup settled against the others did the tension in her shoulders ease. Mason poured water into his palm and held it near her muzzle. You got me this far. Give me 30 seconds. She drank twice, then turned toward the slope again. Mason almost smiled. 30 seconds was generous. He checked the puppies once more before rising. The mother moved ahead, slowly but with certainty, following a scent Mason could now detect whenever the wind shifted. Fuel. It did not belong among wet stone, pine bark, and mountain soil. They climbed roughly 200 yards before the forest changed. The trees were the same, but the ground was not. Tire impressions crossed a patch of bare earth where no public trail appeared on Mason's map. Broken branches had been pushed aside. Near a cluster of rocks, his flashlight caught the edge of a blue plastic container partly covered with a brown tarp. Mason stopped. He did not touch it. Years of training had taught him that curiosity and carelessness were not the same thing. He swept the beam farther, and saw another container 20 feet away, then a length of discarded tubing near a stump. None of it proved anything by itself. Together, it was enough to make him uneasy. The German Shepherd stood beside him, nose working rapidly. "You smelled this before, did you not?" Her ears turned toward the darkness. Mason pulled out his phone. One bar appeared, vanished, then returned. He called the county emergency line and gave the ranger station location, the service road number, and the approximate distance east of the clearing. He kept his voice calm. Suspicious fuel containers. Extremely dry conditions. Possible fire risk. 3 puppies nearby. An exhausted adult German Shepherd. The dispatcher told him a forest ranger and local fire crew would be notified. Mason ended the call and looked at the dog. "Now we go back." She refused. Instead, she moved another few feet uphill and stopped beside a pine. Mason followed her gaze. A faint orange shimmer appeared far between the trunks, the same color he had seen from the ranger station. This time there was no mistaking it for sunset. A thin ribbon of smoke drifted above the trees and disappeared into the night. Mason felt the wind against his cheek. Stronger now, moving southwest, toward the service road, toward scattered homes beyond the lower ridge. He turned immediately. "We get your family first." The shepherd hesitated, then followed. By the time they reached the creek bed, Mason could hear the puppies before he saw them. 2 were stirring beneath his jacket. The smallest remained curled against its mother's scent, breathing softly. Mason gathered all 3 into the blanket and lifted them against his chest. The mother pressed her nose to each one, then looked uphill again. Mason understood. Whatever had happened to her, whatever had put her behind that locked door, she had survived long enough to lead someone here. Not for herself, not even only for her puppies. In the distance, a low engine sounded along the service road. Help was coming. Then the German Shepherd suddenly turned away from the approaching sound. Her ears rose toward a deeper section of forest. She listened for several seconds, perfectly still. Mason listened too. At first, there was only wind. Then, somewhere beyond the creek and beneath the moving trees, came a faint human voice calling once through the darkness. Mason stopped breathing for a second and listened. The voice came again, faint and uneven, carried between the pines before the wind swallowed it. The German Shepherd turned toward the sound at once. Mason looked down at the 3 puppies bundled against his chest, then toward the distant engine approaching along the service road. Help was close, but the voice was not coming from that direction. "All right, girl. Show me." He moved back toward the clearing as quickly as the uneven ground allowed. Headlights appeared through the trees minutes later, followed by a county forest service truck and a volunteer fire department utility vehicle. Mason met them near the abandoned ranger station. Ranger Samuel Hayes stepped out first, a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s with silver hair beneath a green cap. Behind him came Captain Laura Mitchell and 2 firefighters carrying equipment. Mason handed the bundled puppies to Laura and gave Samuel the location of the containers. "There is something else," Mason said. "We heard someone east of the creek." Samuel's expression changed. "One of my seasonal rangers, Owen Parker, was checking an old access route this afternoon. He never radioed back." Mason glanced at the German Shepherd. She was standing beside his leg, exhausted but alert. Samuel noticed her condition. "That dog needs rest. She knows that forest better than we do tonight." The shepherd was already moving. Mason followed, with Samuel close behind. They crossed the creek and continued beyond the place where the fuel smell had first appeared. The orange glow was brighter now, though still distant, touching the lower branches with restless light. Smoke drifted thinly through the timber. No wall of flame, no chaos, just enough to make every minute matter. The dog stopped beside a narrow drainage channel hidden beneath ferns. A weak voice rose from below. "Hello," Samuel called. "Owen." A reply came, clearer this time. "Down here." They found Owen sitting beside a fallen log roughly 10 feet below the trail. He had slipped while checking the drainage and could not climb the steep bank alone. He was cold, tired, and frightened, but conscious. Mason and Samuel guided him carefully upward using a rope from Samuel's pack. When Owen finally reached level ground, he leaned against a tree and looked at the German Shepherd. "That is the dog." Mason turned. Owen swallowed. "I saw her yesterday near the old ranger station. She kept circling my truck, then running east. I thought she was lost." His eyes moved toward the smoke. "She was trying to show me something." Samuel asked about the cage. Owen shook his head. There was no cage when I saw her. The words settled heavily among them. Mason looked through the trees toward the abandoned station. Someone had placed her there after Owen saw her. Someone had made sure she could not return to this part of the forest. A radio crackled on Samuel's shoulder. Captain Mitchell reported that crews had located the first small fire and were moving toward additional suspicious sites Mason had described. The wind was pushing southwest, but they had arrived early enough to respond. Samuel closed his eyes briefly in relief. Beside Mason, the shepherd lowered herself onto the pine needles. For the first time since he had found her, she did not look toward the forest. She looked back toward the ranger station, where her puppies were waiting. Mason knelt and touched the worn collar around her neck. You did your job. Samuel glanced at him. What do you call her? Mason had no answer. Then his eyes caught the soft orange glow beyond the trees, no longer mysterious, no longer unseen. He looked at the dog who had carried that warning through thirst, darkness, and exhaustion. Ember, he said quietly. Her ears lifted at the sound. Mason repeated it once. Ember. And this time, she came when he called. Ember took only a few steps before her strength gave way again. But this time, Mason was there before she reached the ground. He lifted her carefully, and she did not resist. Her head rested against his shoulder as Samuel guided Owen toward the service road, where the glow of emergency lights now moved between the trees. By the time they reached the ranger station, the quiet clearing had changed. Firefighters were arriving from two directions. Radios murmured beneath the wind. Captain Laura Mitchell had placed the 3 puppies inside the warm cab of her utility vehicle, wrapped together in Mason's jacket. The moment Ember saw them, something softened in her face. Mason lowered her beside the open door. She leaned forward and touched each puppy with her nose. 1, 2, 3. Only then did she lie down. Laura watched her for a moment. She was carrying all of that by herself. Mason looked toward the dark forest. Not anymore. Samuel's radio crackled. Crews had found another suspicious fuel container nearly a quarter-mile from the first. Then another farther south. Small fires had begun near 2 locations, but the crews were reaching them while they were still limited to patches of brush and forest floor. The greater concern was the wind. Beyond the southwest ridge sat a scattering of homes, a church retreat center, and a campground scheduled to receive families the next morning. Samuel unfolded a paper map across the hood of his truck. Mason stood beside him while Laura remained with Ember and the puppies. The wind carries everything this way, Samuel said, tracing the ridge with one finger. If nobody had called until sunrise, we might have been dealing with something very different. Mason studied the terrain. He remembered where Ember had paused, where her nose had lifted, where the scent of fuel had strengthened. There was another place, he said, north of the creek, maybe 300 yards from the containers. She reacted there before we heard Owen. Samuel radioed the location to the crews. Minutes later, confirmation came back. Another container had been found near an old maintenance track. No fire there yet. Laura looked down at Ember. She found that too? Mason nodded. Ember was no trained service dog as far as anyone knew. She had no vest, no identification, no handler giving commands. She had only instinct, memory, and 3 puppies waiting beneath a tree. Yet somehow she had kept trying to lead someone toward what did not belong in her forest. Around 2 in the morning, additional crews arrived from neighboring districts. The small fires were contained before they could climb into the trees. Deputies closed the service roads while investigators documented the containers and the abandoned cage. No one offered theories. There would be time for questions after daylight. For now, the forest needed watching, the residents below the ridge needed warning, and 4 exhausted dogs needed somewhere safe. Mason helped Samuel and Laura notify the nearest households. Porch lights came on one by one beneath the mountain. Families gathered pets, medications, and overnight bags, ready to leave if conditions changed. No panic, just preparation. By 3:30, the wind began to weaken. Mason returned to the ranger station, expecting to find Ember asleep. Instead, she was sitting beside Laura's truck, waiting. Her puppies were curled together behind her. When Mason approached, Ember stood and walked slowly toward him. He crouched. She pressed her forehead against his chest and remained there. Mason closed his eyes. For years, he had believed saving someone meant arriving with strength, certainty, and a plan. Ember had arrived with none of those things. She had been thirsty, exhausted, locked away, and almost out of time. Still, she had kept pointing toward what mattered. Samuel approached quietly from behind. Fire crews say the ridge is stable. We caught it early. Mason opened his eyes. Dawn had not arrived yet, but the eastern sky had begun to lose some of its darkness. You caught it, Samuel added. Mason looked at Ember. No. He ran one hand gently over her dusty head. She did. A few minutes later, Mason opened the passenger door of his pickup. He expected Ember to hesitate. She climbed in, turned once on the blanket, then looked back at her puppies. Mason smiled faintly. They are coming too. Laura brought the bundle over and settled the 3 pups beside their mother. Ember lowered herself around them, finally allowing her eyes to close. Mason stood outside the truck as the first pale light touched the tops of the pines. He had come to Oregon to empty a cabin, sell the land, and leave before anything could ask him to stay. Now his jacket belonged to 3 puppies, his passenger seat belonged to their mother, and somewhere in his pocket was a cabin key that suddenly felt heavier than it had the day before. Mason did not drive to the cabin. He drove south, back to Claire Bennett's clinic, while dawn slowly washed the mountains in pale gold. Ember slept beside her puppies for most of the trip, waking only when the truck slowed through town. At the clinic, Claire opened the door before Mason reached it. One look at the bundle in his arms answered every question she had. You found them. Mason nodded. She did. The next several hours passed quietly. Claire examined each puppy, gave them fluids, warmed the smallest beneath a soft blanket, and checked Ember again. None of them were strong, but all 4 were stable. For the first time since Mason had heard that scratching behind the ranger station, there was nothing urgent left for him to do. He sat in a chair beside Ember's recovery pen and discovered that stillness could be harder than danger. His phone rested in his hand. On the screen was an email from the real estate agent. The cabin paperwork was ready. A buyer could visit that afternoon. Mason stared at the message until the screen went dark. Ember lifted her head. Do not start, he murmured. Her tail moved once against the blanket. Mason almost laughed. By late afternoon, Samuel called. The crews had secured the affected areas, and investigators were handling everything found near the old service roads. The homes below the ridge were safe. The campground would remain closed temporarily, but no families had been put in danger. Samuel paused before saying, People around here are calling you a hero. Mason looked through the glass at Ember, curled around 3 sleeping puppies. They have the wrong name. 2 days later, Claire cleared Ember and her puppies to leave the clinic as long as Mason could provide a quiet place for them to recover. He stood in the parking lot with 4 dogs and nowhere he had intended to call home. Then he reached into his pocket and felt the cabin key. 7 miles north, the house waited beneath the pines exactly as his father had left it. Dust on the windows. Firewood stacked beneath the porch. An old fence leaning toward the meadow. Mason had planned to empty every room. Instead, that evening, he opened the front door and carried 3 puppies inside. Ember followed slowly behind him. She stopped at the threshold. Mason set the puppies on a folded quilt near the fireplace and turned back. You can come in. Ember studied the room, then Mason. Finally, she crossed the threshold. Something about that simple step struck him harder than he expected. The next morning, the real estate agent called. Mason stood on the porch watching Ember rest in a patch of sunlight while her puppies stumbled through the grass on oversized paws. Mr. Reed, should I confirm the showing? Mason looked at the weathered railing beneath his hand. He remembered arriving with boxes in the truck and 3 days marked on the calendar. He remembered believing that leaving was the same thing as moving forward. Cancel it, he said. There was a brief silence. The showing? Mason watched Ember rise and walk toward him. The sale? He ended the call and slipped the phone into his pocket. Ember sat beside his boot, leaning gently against his leg. Mason looked across the meadow toward the forest beyond it. He had opened a cage because a dog needed saving. Somehow, days later, he was beginning to understand that not every cage was made of steel. By spring, the mountain had changed its colors. Rain had softened the dry earth, wildflowers appeared along the service roads, and fresh green growth covered the places where firefighters had worked through that long summer night. From Mason's porch, the forest stretched toward the ridge beneath a clear Oregon sky, quiet enough that he could hear wind moving through the Douglas firs. The cabin had changed too. The windows were clean. The broken fence stood straight again, for stainless steel bowls rested beside the kitchen door, though 3 of them rarely stayed where Mason put them. Ember's puppies had grown into long-legged bundles of curiosity, forever chasing pine cones, wrestling in the meadow, and returning to their mother whenever the world became too large. Ember herself looked almost nothing like the exhausted dog Mason had carried from the cage. Her black and tan coat had regained its shine. Her body was strong again. Only the worn collar remained from that night, and even that no longer rested around her neck. Mason had hung it beside his old Navy identification tags near the fireplace. He never explained why. Some things did not need explaining. One Saturday morning, Samuel Hayes drove up the gravel road carrying 2 cups of coffee. He found Mason repairing a porch step while Ember watched from the grass. "Town still tells the story," Samuel said, handing him a cup. Mason raised an eyebrow. "Which version?" Samuel smiled. "The one where a retired Navy SEAL saved half the county." Mason looked toward Ember. She had lifted her head at the sound of a puppy tumbling through the grass. "They are telling it wrong." Samuel took a slow drink. Fire service finished the final report. Those early calls gave crews the time they needed. The ridge, the homes below it, the retreat center, all of it could have turned out differently. Mason said nothing. Across the meadow, Ember walked to the smallest of her puppies, the one Claire had once kept wrapped beneath a warming blanket. He was nearly grown now. She touched her nose to his head, then settled beside him beneath the sunlight. Samuel followed Mason's gaze. "You staying?" Months earlier, that question would have felt like a trap. Now Mason looked at the repaired fence, the stacked firewood, and 4 muddy paw prints across the porch he had cleaned that morning. "Looks that way." Samuel nodded as though he had known the answer before asking. After he left, Mason walked inside and stopped beside the fireplace. His fingers touched the old collar, then the identification tags beside it. One belonged to a dog someone had tried to leave behind. The other belonged to a man who had spent years convincing himself he belonged nowhere. Outside, Ember barked once. Mason stepped onto the porch. The 3 young shepherds raced across the meadow while their mother stood beneath the pines, amber eyes fixed on him. Mason walked down the steps. Ember met him halfway and leaned against his leg. He rested a hand between her ears. Beyond them, new green covered the ridge. The forest had survived. The puppies had survived. Ember had survived. Mason looked toward the cabin and understood that survival had never been the whole miracle. Sometimes a life was saved so it could return to what it loved. Sometimes it was saved so it could lead another life home. The wind moved softly through the trees. Ember closed her eyes beneath his hand. And for once, Mason Reed had nowhere else he needed to be.